to Room for Thought, SilverDoor's podcast, where we sit down with some of the brilliant minds in our industry to talk about the things that really shape global mobility, the challenges, the opportunities, and everything in between. I'm Malynda Seeger, and today we're diving into something that comes up a lot in our world, but isn't always talked about directly. The success of a relocation isn't usually about whether the logistics ran smoothly. It's about the human side of the experience. It's whether someone actually settles in, whether they feel connected, whether their partner or family are thriving, and ultimately, whether they can show up at work and perform at their best, or whether they're quietly struggling in the background. From where we sit at SilverDoor, we tend to see the human side of relocation, a bit of a window into how things are landing for the individual, more than the day-to-day of the assignment. So this is a great opportunity for us to explore that further. Today, we're getting into those often overlooked elements: culture, connection, and what real return on investment in global mobility actually looks like. I'm really excited about this conversation because I'm joined by two fantastic guests. Joining us today is Lauren Slattery. Lauren leads the global mobility at NetApp. Lauren spends her time navigating the complexity of mobility and immigration, always with a focus on balancing business needs with a genuinely great employee experience, which is something we see firsthand working alongside mobility teams. And on a personal note, Lauren describes herself as a bit of a recovering overplanner and a travel enthusiast. I think a lot of us can probably relate to that. We're also joined today by Patti McCarthy, founder of Cultural Chemistry. Patti has spent over 15 years helping organizations turn cultural differences into a real advantage. What I really appreciate about Patti's approach is how practical and people-focused it is. She's not just talking about culture in theory, but really helping businesses and individuals navigate it day to day in a way that actually makes a difference. Before we dive in, I'd love to invite you both briefly to introduce yourselves and tell us a bit more about your organizations. Lauren?
Yeah, thanks, Malynda. That's very kind. So my name is Lauren. I'm with NetApp. We are a technology company focused on helping organizations make sense of and get the most out of their data. We are headquartered in San Jose, California, but have offices all over the world. We work with customers around the world to simplify how they manage data and help them prepare for everything from cloud transformation to AI.
Thanks. Well, I'm at the other end of the spectrum. There's just me, and I'm in Oxford in the UK, but I obviously partner with people all over the world when necessary. And yes, as you kindly said, Malynda, I'm very much a people focus and probably do my best work working with individuals as a coach or in small teams, helping them to adapt and understand cultural differences. I think the impact of AI on my kind of service is very concerning. But what I really see is that it's not ever going to take the place of an empathetic ear and some very real lived personal experience. And that's where I still think that what people like me will offer will continue to be needed.
So Lauren, as we look at ROI in global mobility, how has the industry traditionally defined success? And are these definitions still relevant today?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think a good place for us to center this discussion. I think traditionally global mobility has measured success by whether the move happened, the assignment was completed, or the budget stayed on track. Those things still matter, but they're really only part of the story. Today, I think we need to look beyond the relocation itself and ask whether the employee was truly able to integrate, to grow, or stay engaged. When people feel connected to their new environment, they're more likely to succeed. We know this. They're more likely to stay with the company and deliver the long-term business impact. And for me, that's where the real ROI comes from.
And can I add to that to say, I think the real ROI also comes from whether that individual is able to connect to their colleagues and clients in the new place. Because if they're not going to be successful in their new role. So we're really talking about sort of opportunity cost here. not knowing how much better that individual could have performed if they had understood that they needed to change the way that they approached sales or customer feedback or whatever the issue was, that they actually work in the not only the local language if it's required, but to align themselves with the local cultural values.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think I've seen happiness factor as a KPI on a report. So I absolutely appreciate that. Having our individuals and our guests and transferees and families really, hopefully enjoying the experience, but if not, at least it not being a painful experience for them. So, Patti, working across multiple clients with a different perspective from one to the next, what are the factors that most reliably predict assignment success or failure?
Well, I think as Lauren said, it's whether the individual is happy, and that is predicted by whether they are feeling comfortable in their new environment. And, I think when somebody goes to the workplace, they're either turning up with their whole self and giving their new job the best possible chance, or they're hugely distracted by worrying about what's going on at home, which is why we talk about looking after the entire family and not just the relocatee, themselves. So, and I think that really that is what success in assignments stands or falls by, whether that person is integrated professionally and personally into their new location.
And Lauren, what are some of the methods that you have implemented there at NetApp or otherwise in the context of cultural training to support the assignment success?
Yeah, I think one thing I've learned over the years is that cultural integration doesn't just happen because someone gets on a plane and arrives in a new country, right? We have to be intentional about creating connections and support systems inside and outside of the office, right? So to Patti's point, we have to look at the individual and the family as a unit. And I think if you untangle that intentionally, you will reap those kind of repercussions down the road. Some of the most effective things I think can actually be quite simple. Buddy programs can make a huge difference by connecting assignees or relocators with someone who's already navigated the move, maybe even in a similar, season of life. So connecting in some single folks together, maybe some families, right? Folks who have come from other countries, I think can share same and lived experience, and that can really be beneficial to supporting that whole person or whole family in integration. I think it can also provide them with a buddy to ask questions that they may not feel comfortable asking their manager or even direct coworkers, right? I think when we join a new company or we go somewhere for the first time, it's really important that we want to show up as professional or show up as your best self, and sometimes asking if which color eggs I should buy at the market, brown or white, is maybe not something you want to ask your manager on your first one-on-one. So I think it's a good moment in time to make sure that they really have the right support in place from the beginning to have that kind of anchor to success. I think about the early in career population a lot in my job. I think international assignments to them may be the first time they're living away from their family, right? Working in a different culture or building a network from scratch. Those can all be very new and different things. They often need different levels of support than maybe a more seasoned traveler or someone that's relocated a few times. And so caring for that population differently has served us well at NetApp. We've got a really strong program here where we bring in early in career folks to learn and to grow intentionally at NetApp. And part of that is having that investment up front to ensure that they have the resources that they need to not only find community, but also find resources like learning about how tap to pay works here, or how a washer machine is set up, right? Malynda, we've had discussion in particular with how SilverDoor has come alongside and supported this specific population in really interesting ways to ensure that they can find success, whatever that needs to look like. I think ultimately at the end of the day, the goal is to help people feel like they belong, not just at work, but in their new community. And when that happens, they're more likely to succeed personally and professionally, which ultimately benefits both the employee and the business.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think getting those little details that might miss our thought process and planning ahead of time, but also the debriefs. We know if you have a program that's coming in, or even an individual, understanding those things and making changes to shift for the next group or the next person.
I think it's also really important that employers don't think that they can apply a one-size-fits-all treatment to this. As Lauren said, there's got to be individualized approaches so that somebody who is moving for the first time does actually get some help with adjusting to being an expat. Because a lot of my clients, they say, well, we'll provide cultural training. And I say, well, what about them, helping them to actually settle into to make Melbourne their home, to make Mumbai their home, wherever? Oh, no, just the business. And it's like, well, you're wasting your money if you're just going to talk about business culture, because if they're not happy there, they're not going to stay, no matter how good they are at doing business in that country. So, and I find, at the other end, people who have moved a lot already will often be quite dismissive of cultural training and say, oh, I don't need it. I'm going to Japan often on business, so I don't need any help just because I'm moving there. And so, well, that's a completely different kettle of fish to actually live there 24/7 than to fly in and out on a regular basis. So yes, you do. And there's no shame in getting help. I do often get a feeling that people don't want to ask for help because it makes them look a bit weak and needy. And to your point, Lauren, having a buddy system with someone who is at a completely different managerial level is a complete waste of time, because a very junior person will not ask a senior person for information, and the senior person will often sort of make them feel as though they're kind of too busy to be looking after them. So these things have got to be done thoughtfully and not just as a sort of tick box exercise.
Yeah, absolutely. Patti, that was a really great segue into our next question.
Excellent.
So, from your perspective, what does cultural training actually look like in today's modern programs? What are the folks going through day in, day out when they're working with you?
So in the old days, when cultural training first started to be a thing, so we're talking about 1970s, and people started compiling these cultural profiles. So, and then, for the next sort of 30 years, I'd say, oh, well, if you're going to work in the Netherlands, this is what Dutch people do. This is how they think, this is how they talk, this is how they behave. And the same for sort of, 70 plus countries in the world. And if you like, back then we were apples, or we were bananas, or we were melons. Now we're fruit salads. It's very common for somebody like me to have, I've got two English parents. I was brought up in Belgium and America. I lived a long time in Australia. I lived in Singapore. I've been an expat, a repat, an expat with children, a working expat. I'm all these different things. And you look at a cultural profile of the UK, you would not find me. And I think that people who rely too much on those kind of models, which again is where I think AI takes us down a sort of a wrong path, because it's like, I'm moving to, Belgium, what do I need to know? And it will list off a group of characteristics, but it won't take into account the fact that the guy that you're going to be working for was Belgian, but one of his parents is Spanish and he was brought up in Venezuela. So it's about, what I focus on is encouraging people to look for difference. And so to look for what they have in common so that they can build rapport, but also be aware that there are going to be differences, and then think about, well, how can I close that gap? So in my book, Cultural Chemistry, I created a sort of coaching model to go through this, which I call the 4 R's. And the first one is rewards. So, well, what's the outcome for you? Why is it worth investing a bit of your time and energy in getting this right? The second is research. So given your situation, what do you need to know? Are you trying to sell toothbrushes in India, or are you trying to sell shoes in Brazil, or who are you dealing with? So what do you need to know about the people that you're going to work with? The third R is reflect. And it's actually, if you think of cultural intelligence as like a kaleidoscope that you kind of look through both ends. So you look through one end and you see them, and then you look through the other end and you see yourself. And you think, well, how do I come across to other people when I stick out my hand and give a hearty handshake, or I make, a lot of strong eye contact, or I'm like, hey, how are you doing? How do they perceive me? And so it's very important that we don't just learn about others, but that we learn about ourselves too. And then the last R is to reach out. So you identified, okay, I'm here and they're here. How are we going to cross that bridge and actually make some connections? And I talk about things like building rapport. I teach people how to do that. I make people aware of where they are responding through judging other people by their own values rather than actually what works and what is acceptable in another country.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I thank you for your fruit salad reference. That's we're almost at lunchtime, so making me hungry. No, it's really, really great perspective, and I love breaking it down into 4 R's. That is something that is tangible, that someone can work with, and maybe one more R, report back, right? And whether that's just to themselves or otherwise. So that's really fantastic. Lauren, in your day to day, what is your program looking like these days? And maybe an evolution that you've seen, like Patti shared the evolution that she's seen.
Yeah, no, I think when we look at modern day programs, right, we look at how we've designed our packages. And at NetApp, we've taken a really strong stance and view destination services and cultural training as a almost a mode of compliance. We build our policies here at NetApp, right, on the foundation of compliance. So that is the through line. So immigration, tax support, of course, but also destination services. And I think anyone in the mobility space can appreciate that there are probably components of that will be tied up through maybe seeking a social security number or doing a local registration, but that cultural piece is still really important. And so anytime we've got a move or an assignee, right, that is one of the easiest levers to pull. That's one of the highest, again, ROI, kind of going back to that concept of, yes, it's a little bit of cash up front, but the investment is high when we think about their integration. I think ultimately, cultural training has evolved well beyond just maybe a one-time briefing about local customs or business etiquette, as Patti mentioned, right? It's really about helping the employees build awareness and confidence and connections inside and outside the office so that they can find success in the new environment.
I think, if I may, it needs rebranding, basically. I don't think it should be billed as cultural training, because a lot of people, unfortunately, are quite arrogant and think, oh, well, I'm good with that. I don't need it. I sell my kind of packages as expatriate support programs. Mm-hmm. And then, honestly, it's anything that they need. And it will be some cultural training, but it might also be helping the partner to write their CV in a way that is, or it is relevant for them. Or it might be connecting that person to someone that I know who lives in that city, or it will be whatever they need, rather than a prescriptive, this is what we're going to provide for you. Let's respond to people's needs rather than just sort of put down the menu of this is what you can have. And some people will want career support. And some people also, in fact, a lot of people, I'd say, they want to come back to me a few months after they've been there and say, I'm still really struggling with this element of the culture, or I did this today and I definitely got the feeling that I made a bum steer, what did I do wrong? Or I've got this invitation from the managing director to go to this event and I'm supposed to wear cocktail wear. What does that mean? It's having someone in your pocket who you can call with any kind of question. And sometimes I'm on the phone with people, on a training session for 3 hours, and other times it might be a 5-minute phone call. And that kind of support that is tailored to the individual is much more suitable and appropriate than a sort of prescriptive one. And it can still be costed. You can say, right, well, you can have 6 hours of whatever you need. So people can obviously keep a handle on the costs. But I just think that kind of treatment makes people feel more important as individuals rather than just sort of, cogs in the wheel and the next item off the expatriate sort of machine.
Yeah, I really like that concept of kind of on-demand support, right? With a human that gets it, that knows their story, right? You've been with them since the beginning, you know, and understand their family. And so being able to pitch hit kind of in real time, whether that's business travel or an etiquette question, right? I think is really valuable. And after the newness of a move wears off, right? You're really sitting with reality, and that can be hard and different, and there can be tensions in that. And so I love the concept of having that kind of on-demand support. We should whiteboard this. I think this is very
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah. Well, renaming is definitely, you know, in order, I think. And as an example, I worked with an Indian man and his family who had moved from Dubai to Manchester in the north of England during COVID. And so we had done the cultural training, we had talked through the differences that he was going to encounter. And so we'd spent sort of 3 or 4 hours together, and his wife wanted to work as an Ayurvedic medicine practitioner. And so I'd sort of done some research for her and things. And then suddenly we got on a call and he said, I don't want to be here. And I said, oh, okay, what's happened? You know, and he went through this sort of list of the things that he was finding really difficult to adjust to. And what I was able to do was actually point out that everything he was hating about being in Manchester were the same things that he would hate if he were still in Dubai, because it was actually to do with COVID and nothing to do with the expatriation. And it was all about isolation and not seeing friends and family and, you know, et cetera, not going into the office. And because I knew him quite well, I was able to say, but you've told me this already and you've told me that. And within the space of an hour, I had basically talked him round into staying. And I was able to do that because I knew him. I had a relationship with him. And you can't do that with a sort of document that, you know, there's quite a lot of companies that I used to work with have now gone over to providing sort of cultural training online. And so you read documentation and then you tick the box to say that you've read it and you've understood it. And that doesn't help you when you're suddenly thinking, oh, I've made a terrible mistake and I shouldn't have been here and my partner's really unhappy and my kid hates it. And, you know, who do you talk to? You certainly can't tell your boss that.
Yeah. Well, Patti, I think that's the definition of ROI for what we're talking about today, right? Yeah. Is when the lumps and bumps come along, to be able to navigate through those and hopefully get through them and continue with a successful transition or project or, you know, whatever that person and their family are they're doing. And I think too, same on the buddy system that Lauren was talking about earlier, having in whichever direction and choice that you're utilizing to support your employees, but having that person later on down the line, I think makes a really, really good tool and resource for folks to use. And
just a side note for Patti, I can't think of a better spend of money for an hour of support from cultural chemistry, right? From a business perspective, there's such value in that, and there's such value in knowing the people, the family, but really just even broadening kind of the ecosystem, like having your immigration attorneys know your people, your from your RMCs, right? Your temp housing, right? When they know the people, they can maybe predict some of these pitfalls. They can step in and fill in the gaps. And as you know, from a client perspective, when you come to me with requesting maybe an hour top off or something, that's an easy sell. And so what a massive value.
And what I often find is that I kind of act as a bit of a referee sometimes, or an umpire between people. And I find particularly people from Southeast Asian countries where they are typically much more hierarchical. They find it very difficult to go to their boss or even to their HR manager to say, I'm really struggling with this. But they'll tell me, and then either I will give them the answer and set their mind at rest, or I will intervene on their behalf and say to their manager, these are the things that this person is really struggling with. And so, you know, as an example, I worked with a young Vietnamese man in Australia, and I was called in because his Australian manager said, he's a really hard worker, but he's just got no initiative. And whenever I say, what do you think of this idea? He just always says, yeah, it's a great idea. And he said, I know he's got more, but he doesn't give it to me. And so I worked with this young man, let's call him Vincent. And he said, oh, well, I can't disagree. He's the boss. And, in Vincent's Vietnamese culture, he was brought up to always agree with the boss and always to say, yeah, whatever the boss is like the most amazing idea. So, and he said, even if I disagree, I can't say it, I would lose my job. So I was like, well, no, you wouldn't actually. In Australia, people are really praised for speaking their mind. And so long as you do it in a way that is polite and constructive, people would be happy that you actually contribute rather than just acquiescing all the time. But I also said to his manager, you've got to understand Vincent's point of view and his upbringing. And as a manager, you have to not just say, what do you think, Vincent? You have to say, I recognize that this is a bit difficult for you, Vincent, but I would really appreciate your feedback. And you're not going to get in trouble for telling me what you really think. And that's about meeting in the middle.
Yeah. Opening that door, right? Opening that door.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it. Well, I'm glad we've got to talk a little bit about the beginning, a little bit now about the middle of someone coming in. But I don't want to forget about repatriation. So from both of you, I'd love to hear your perspective. What should the mobility managers that are listening to us on this wonderful podcast today, what should they consider when supporting employees and families moving home once that project or, transition or just a new opportunity comes up for them and they're going back to their home country? What should they consider?
Yeah, I don't mind jumping in here. I think repatriation generally is one of the most overlooked parts of the mobility life cycle, right? We spend so much time and effort preparing employees and families for the move abroad, but we often assume coming home is the easy part. And honestly, that's maybe where some of the real work begins. I think in reality, returning can be just as disruptive as the initial move. And we should not be overlooking that experience. Employees come back, right, with new skills, broader perspectives, different expectations, perhaps about their career. And I think that's why communication is so important. We've got to set realistic expectations early, talk openly about the challenges of repatriation, but also have a plan for when they return. I think we can point to maybe the usual life cycles in a company around rewards programs or even performance reviews and how we leverage those discussions while they're on assignment, but also really looking towards, with the end in mind. What does it mean when an employee has now harnessed these skills or built up this team or whatever their purpose is? What is next? And have that communicated. I think from a business perspective, if we don't invest in a successful return, we risk losing the very talent we just spent big time and big money cultivating. And honestly, maybe that's where the best or the most long-term ROI is actually realized, is on the return. And I think that's something we talk about is passed down information or information and cultural context, right? That team member now can provide back to their home team. And so I think it's something that it's hard to nail, right? It's hard to nail. It's very personalized. It's going to be kind of an individual performance journey. And I think that maybe is where some of the maybe more interesting meat of that assignment can come from.
I completely agree. It's so under-resourced. And when I talk to my clients when they're outgoing about the sort of stages of cultural shock, I was stage 5, which is going home again, just to plant that seed that actually, you thought it was hard moving from Boston to Singapore, but actually moving from Singapore back to Boston is going to be a whole lot harder. And part of the problem is that people think it's going to be easy because they think, oh, I'm just going back and everything is familiar and, life will continue as it was before. But in their heads, they're sort of expecting a ticker tape parade and, yeah, you're back. And the reality is like, oh, you're back. Yeah, if my garage door is really messing up at the moment and, oh, you've been in China. That's great. Yeah, tell me later. But, meanwhile, like this tire on my bike and within 3 weeks, people can be really struggling. with sort of homesickness for where they've left. And, there are professional challenges too, not just as Lauren was saying, with the sort of taking their newly expensively acquired information and moving on, but they might have been in a sort of outpost where they were a really big fish in a small pond. And then suddenly they go back to a big corporate HQ and they're back to being a small fish in a big pond again. And that's really galling professionally. So people can feel very underutilized, they can feel underappreciated, they've lost their status. And meanwhile, let's be honest, often the accompanying partner still is a woman. And, and so there will be issues at home with people having left places where perhaps they had live-in domestic help. And suddenly they're going back to doing it all yourself and queuing up at the supermarket or doing your online shopping, or, all of those difficult, and it all comes at once. It all comes at once. And it's not surprising that some people just, take a complete dive.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I can appreciate that from a few different perspectives. So as far as your suggestion on what global mobility teams and managers might do and how to support those folks, obviously the intent is to bring back that knowledge that whatever the reason was that they transitioned into that trip or that relocation or that training or whatever it was that moved them to that new part of the world. What would be a good suggestion that you would have on how to best support them on that return home?
Yeah, I think it starts with the end in mind. I think when we look at our policies, when we look at how we have foundationally created our programs, we have to have really strong reverse support. And that's something, again, that's often overlooked. You can look at the kind of the semantics of it, of, making sure they, turn off the electricity and clean out their temporary housing. And, I think that those are really important things, but I think it's building in policy support for time, for hours, however, your policies look, and ensuring that your folks are utilizing those benefits on the return. And keeping, again, the end in mind. And so keeping that continuous discussion. And if you've got a Patti in your life, right, call yourself blessed, because I think that having that through line, that consistent support is a difference maker. And so, going with Patti, right, thinking through how, she would support before, during, and towards the end, it's going to be a consistent experience. It's going to be that same level of empathy and care, and it's going to be bringing things to mind that maybe that individual has not even thought through. But it starts with having that built into the policy.
Yeah, it does. And again, I'd say a lot of people, if they have to ask for help, they won't. They'll just struggle. And so actually having it offered and say, this is mandatory. So I find probably 7 out of 10 people that I work with, let's say 10 out of 10 people that I don't work with have been offered cultural training, and 7 out of 10 of them have said, I don't need it. So only 3 out of 10 are actually acknowledging that there's a knowledge gap that they could benefit from. And so often, if they have the choice of taking it or not, they choose not to. And they don't know what they don't know. So they don't know the problems that is creating for them. And the same with repatriation. If you say this is a compulsory part of your repatriation, is that we help you to transition back in. It's a bit like with the lump sum argument that comes up often when I talk to people, where expats are offered either some cultural support or training and settling in services, or they're offered the lump sum. And they'll take the lump sum, thank you very much, and buy themselves a new surfboard or, whatever it is that they want, because they don't know what they don't know, and they don't know how much they need that extra support. So I think a lot of these things would be much better if they were mandated rather than opt-in.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think, Patti, you mentioned earlier about that 10-minute phone call, helping someone in that crisis moment that only took a few minutes. But it was an ongoing conversation that you've been having from the beginning of their move and their transfer. So maybe that is a potential option. Just 10 minutes, right? Just make the 10 minutes a mandatory. And then if they want more, then they can opt for more. And that way they can get that feel and get that sense of comfort. It would be a very quick interview, I think, from cultural, from your perspective, Patti. But that may be a way to open that door for folks that might not appreciate what it is, what that cultural training is, and how helpful it might be for them.
Yeah, and as I say, if we actually talked about it as sort of expat support services rather than cultural training, then people just view it much more as like a woolly blanket, to like a virtual, oh, this will help me and the family to settle into acclimatise. It'll help me at work. It'll help them at home, these guys at school, whatever is needed. Then, people will pretend to themselves that they're not going to use the support. And, I have this sometimes when I'm working with a partner and their partner happens to hear it and they're like, oh, that sounds really interesting. And the next thing I know, they're both on the call, so because perhaps, people find it difficult to admit that they would actually like a bit of help. So
yeah, absolutely. They're working one day at a time, 1 minute at a time, getting through something, and you have the opportunity to support at a bigger picture level. I very much appreciate that. Well, thank you so much. It's been so great having this conversation today. I feel like we've covered a lot that really doesn't get talked a lot about. It's a little bit more in our world. So I'm really pleased that we can bring this topic to light. It really makes a difference when it comes to successful relocations. Lauren, Patti, thank you. Thank you both so much for sharing your insights and experiences. It's been a very, very valuable discussion. And to those listening, thank you so much. If you've enjoyed this episode, you can find Room for Thought on SilverDoor's LinkedIn, and be sure to follow along for future conversations like this one. Have a great day, everyone.